The sound that should mark the beginning of a peaceful morning, the soft ringing of a church bell, was instead drowned out by gunfire. In a small village in northern Nigeria, children who had woken up with their notebooks tucked under their arms suddenly found themselves running for their lives. A young girl no more than 8 or 9 tripped on the dusty road as armed men stormed the schoolyard. Behind her, mothers screamed her name. Ahead of her, silence, an empty field, and the hope she could reach it. Moments like these used to shock the world. Now they are happening so often that even grief is struggling to keep up. For many Americans, the headlines barely capture the scale of what is unfolding. Dozens of children kidnapped from their classrooms, churches attacked during morning worship, entire communities living with the sound of gunfire as their daily background music. And in the middle of it all, a question rises like smoke from a burning home. How can this continue without the world stepping in? Even former President Donald Trump, known for his blunt language, could not hide his anger. He called the situation a genocide, a disgrace that should have been confronted long ago. For the first time in years, the crisis in Nigeria is pulling the attention of the United States leaders, diplomats, even celebrities toward a humanitarian nightmare that refuses to fade. But beyond politics, beyond diplomacy, lies a deeper truth. These are children, families, worshippers, people who never imagined their lives would be reduced to numbers on a news ticker. So before we continue, let me ask you, if this were your granddaughter, your neighbor's child, your church on a quiet Sunday morning, would silence still feel acceptable? If you believe stories like these must be told and that the world cannot afford to look away, I invite you to stay with me through this entire video. Please share this message if you stand for protecting innocent lives, and subscribe if you believe truth must matter more than headlines. The crisis in Nigeria did not erupt in a single moment. It unfolded through a series of violent mornings, each one worse, each one hauntingly familiar. The first major incident of the week came from a Catholic boarding school in northwestern Nigeria, where students were lining up for attendance just as the sun began to rise. Witnesses said a cloud of dust signaled the arrival of motorcycles. Then came the shouts, then the gunfire. Within minutes, as many as 52 children were forced into the back of trucks, the youngest barely old enough to write their own names. A desperate search began before the echoes of the gunshots had even faded, but parents already knew what this meant. Another group of children swallowed by the forests, controlled by militant groups. Only a few days earlier, a nearby Catholic church had been attacked during morning worship. Congregants were singing when the doors were blown open. The attackers moved with grim confidence. 2 worshippers were killed instantly, and 38 others were kidnapped, dragged out of the sacred space where they had come to pray for peace. For the families left behind, the wooden pews stained with blood were a reminder that nowhere, neither school nor sanctuary, is safe anymore. These are not isolated tragedies. They are part of a relentless pattern driven by more than 22 active terrorist groups operating across Nigeria, from Boko Haram to factions that have formally pledged allegiance to ISIS. Their strategy is simple and brutal: strike the vulnerable, instill terror, and profit from ransom. The amounts demanded can reach $69,000 per person, a sum impossible for most rural families, but highly effective for militants seeking to finance their operations. The cruelty of these attacks becomes even more vivid when listening to those who have stood on the front lines. One former U.S. Navy SEAL who spent years training Nigerian special forces recounted the missions to recover kidnapped girls. His voice cracked as he described little girls 8 or 9 years old taken from their classrooms and sold into Islamic sex slavery. He said some were rescued, but not all of them, a phrase that lingered painfully in the air. For him, a father of a daughter, the horror is not abstract. It is personal, unforgettable, and enraging. And yet, despite the global shock, the attacks keep coming. Earlier that same week, in another village several miles away, 25 more children were kidnapped from a Muslim area school. One boy managed to escape and later told authorities that the militants didn't discriminate. They wanted children, any children, to fuel their operations and intimidate the population. The idea that Muslim families are also victims contradicts the narrative that this violence is purely religious, but it reinforces a deeper truth: extremism thrives where governments fail. That failure is at the heart of the growing frustration. For years, officials in Abuja have claimed they are not persecuting any religious group, but analysts, humanitarian workers, and increasingly the U.S. Government argues something even more alarming, that the Nigerian leadership has lost control of vast regions of its own country and is failing to protect even the most basic right, the right to live without fear. This sense of abandonment is evident in the way ordinary people speak about their lives. Parents no longer ask if their children will be safe, they ask how long until their community becomes the next headline. Priests preach behind locked doors. Teachers conduct roll call with trembling hands. And in the villages most targeted by terrorists, the simple act of walking to school has become an act of courage. By the time these incidents reached American screens, the number of Christians killed in recent years had climbed into the thousands. The number of kidnapped children had become almost impossible to track. What once shocked the world had become a disturbing rhythm. And each new attack only underscored a single devastating reality: the attackers are getting bolder and the defenders are not catching up. The turning point in this unfolding tragedy did not come from Nigeria itself. It erupted thousands of miles away inside an American television studio when former President Donald Trump spoke with a fury that even his critics could not ignore. His words were not polished or diplomatic. They were raw, sharp, and heavy with accusation. It is a disgrace. They are killing people by the thousands. It is a genocide. For older Americans watching at home, many of whom remember foreign crises only becoming real once a U.S. president acknowledged them, Trump's declaration felt like an alarm bell ringing across continents. His anger, however, did not arise in a vacuum. For weeks, American media had been reporting the escalation of violence: children stolen from classrooms, Catholic churches attacked in broad daylight. But it was Trump's decision to lean in, as the host Harris Faulkner described it, that pushed the crisis onto the center stage of U.S. political conversation. Sitting on a panel at the United Nations, Harris recounted how Ambassador Michael Waltz specifically requested a high-level discussion on Nigeria's deteriorating security. And in a move that surprised many, he invited rapper Nicki Minaj simply because her pastor is Nigerian and had become an outspoken advocate for the victims. It was an unusual combination: diplomats, journalists, a former president, and a global celebrity, all focused on the same humanitarian emergency. That unlikely gathering symbolized a broader truth. The crisis had reached a point where traditional diplomatic channels were no longer enough. Something more forceful, more visible, perhaps even more controversial was required. And Trump provided exactly that. He accused the Nigerian government of being ineffective, even suggesting that the United States might cut aid or deploy troops if Abuja failed to protect its citizens. The possibility of U.S. military involvement in Nigeria, a country with deep ties to Washington, sent shockwaves through political circles. The U.S. State Department, often more cautious in its language, confirmed that the administration was already developing a plan to compel the Nigerian government to improve religious freedom and protect their communities. That word, compel, carried a weight that diplomats rarely use unless the situation is spiraling beyond control. It hinted at sanctions, restrictions, and potentially coordinated international pressure. Meanwhile, intelligence analysts emphasized that the violence was not only targeting Christians, even though they remained the primary victims. The attack on a Muslim area school earlier that week, where militants kidnapped 25 children, revealed a more complex reality. Extremist groups were expanding their reach, desperate for hostages, ransom, money, and territory. Still, the attacks on Catholic schools and churches remained the most emotionally charged, especially for American audiences who viewed such sanctuaries as sacred spaces that should never become battlegrounds. For the families in Nigeria, the global attention brought a mixture of relief and sorrow. Relief because finally the world seemed to care. Sorrow because they wished this attention had come sooner, before so many lives were lost. Mothers knelt outside burned church doors, clutching photographs of missing children. Fathers searched the forests along militant routes, refusing to give up even when hope thinned. Local priests reported receiving dozens of calls each day. "Have you seen my daughter? Have you heard anything?" But the reaction that defined this phase of the crisis came from the Nigerian government itself. Under criticism from Washington, and the global press officials insisted that they were not persecuting any religious community. Their statements, however, did little to calm the rising frustration. Analysts noted that the government's responses sounded more defensive than determined. And for people living in the danger zones, that defensiveness felt like betrayal. The combination of Trump's fiery remarks, high-level UN discussions, celebrity advocacy, and continuous media coverage created a moment of global focus, one in which Nigeria's crisis could no longer be dismissed as a distant problem. It had become a test of leadership, a test of diplomacy, and above all, a test of whether the world could remain silent while children disappeared into the shadows of ungoverned lands. At this stage, the crisis had reached its emotional and political peak, and yet the most devastating consequences, those that would reshape communities, governments, and international alliances, were still to come. The human cost of Nigeria's crisis is not measured only by the number of kidnapped children or the tally of those killed. It is measured in the way ordinary life has slowly collapsed, school by school, village by village, Sunday by Sunday. In the communities hit hardest by the violence, routines that once defined daily life have disappeared. Teachers now arrive at school not with lesson plans, but with evacuation drills. Parents no longer pack lunches for their children, they pack prayers hoping their sons and daughters return home before sunset. In some villages, classrooms sit completely empty, their chalkboards still showing unfinished lessons from the day the militants came. For families who lost children, grief becomes a permanent companion. Many mothers speak in whispers, as if the quiet might somehow protect the children who remain. Some refuse to move from the last place they saw their sons or daughters, sitting for hours on the same patch of ground where the school gates once stood open. Fathers search the bushland for weeks at a time, guided only by rumors, or the faint hope that a child might have escaped and wandered toward a nearby settlement. The trauma does not fade, because every new attack reminds them that what happened once can happen again. Churches, once the emotional and spiritual heart of Nigerian communities, now operate under a shadow of fear. Priests lead prayers behind barricaded doors. Congregations gather with a mix of devotion and dread, knowing that even worship has become a dangerous act. Some parishes have installed whistles under the pews if gunmen approach the congregation knows to run. What was once a sanctuary is now a symbol of vulnerability. The political consequences are just as haunting. Trust between citizens and their government has eroded to almost nothing. Many Nigerians feel abandoned by leaders who appear disconnected from the suffering on the ground. When officials insist there is no religious persecution, it rings hollow in villages where bodies are buried every month. The anger is not abstract, it is deeply personal, born from the belief that the government has failed in its most basic duty to protect the lives of its people. This erosion of trust has created a dangerous vacuum. As faith in the state weakens, extremist groups gain ground not only geographically, but psychologically. In some regions, militants now act as the de facto authority, demanding taxes, enforcing curfews, and controlling movement. The line between terrorism and governance blurs, leaving civilians trapped between fear and survival. The rise of these parallel power structures threatens the very idea of a unified Nigeria. Internationally, the crisis has complicated Nigeria's diplomatic relationships. Western partners, especially the United States, are openly questioning Abuja's competence. Discussions of sanctions and conditional aid have intensified. The threat of losing U.S. military cooperation alarms Nigerian officials, but for many analysts, the warning comes too late. Years of slow, inconsistent responses have allowed extremist networks to deepen their roots. Moreover, Nigeria's instability poses a threat that stretches far beyond its borders. Countries across West Africa worry that the unchecked expansion of Boko Haram and ISIS-affiliated groups could spill into neighboring states, undermining regional security. The fear is clear: if Nigeria, the most populous nation in Africa and one of the continent's largest economies, cannot contain this crisis, smaller nations stand little chance on their own. But perhaps the most tragic consequence is the normalization of fear. Entire generations of Nigerian children are growing up believing that school is dangerous, that prayer is dangerous, that being a girl is dangerous. Their futures shrink as violence grows, and the world, even when it pays attention, can only watch as families try to rebuild what has been shattered. From the perspective of the United States, the crisis in Nigeria has never been just a distant tragedy. It is a test of global stability, a warning sign of what happens when a major regional power loses its grip on internal security. For American policymakers, especially those who lived through decades of conflict with extremist groups in the Middle East, the situation feels unsettlingly familiar. The pattern is one they recognize: ungoverned territories, expanding terrorist factions, recruiting with ease, and civilian populations caught in the crossfire. The echoes of Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria are impossible to ignore. This is why Washington is watching Nigeria with such intensity. As the largest democracy in Africa, Nigeria is central to U.S. strategic interests. Its population, economy, and geographic influence make it the anchor of West Africa. If it descends into deeper chaos, the ripple effects will destabilize an entire region, already strained by insurgencies in Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Chad. For American diplomats, the thought of a new terror corridor stretching from the Sahara to the Gulf of Guinea is not abstract. It is a nightmare scenario with direct implications for global security. There is also a moral dimension shaping America's reaction. For many older Americans, especially Christian communities, the reports of churches burned, worshipers killed, and children kidnapped during Sunday services strike a deeply emotional chord. It reminds them of historical moments when the United States felt compelled to speak out Bosnia, Darfur, Iraq's Nineveh Plains. The language used by Trump calling the violence genocide mirrors the urgency that faith-based groups across the U.S. have felt for years. These communities have long advocated for international intervention, arguing that silence only empowers extremists. Globally, the reaction is mixed. Some Western nations share America's concern, but hesitate to commit to action, wary of becoming entangled in another complex conflict. Others question whether Nigeria's government is capable of genuine reform, pointing to years of mismanagement and corruption that have weakened state institutions. Human rights organizations emphasize that the crisis is not solely religious. They highlight the kidnapping of Muslim children, the displacement of farmers, and the collapse of law enforcement. Their message is clear: the entire civilian population is suffering regardless of faith. Within Africa, the crisis in Nigeria has become a symbol of deeper questions about governance, security, and sovereignty. Leaders in West Africa express fears that instability in Nigeria could accelerate the rise of extremist networks already threatening other nations. Meanwhile, discussions circulate about alternative approaches to security approaches seen in places like Burkina Faso under President Ibrahim Traore, where governments are rebuilding local defense systems, tightening borders, and rejecting foreign military dependency. Whether or not one agrees with Traore's methods, the contrast is impossible to ignore: one nation losing control, another doubling down on self-determined security. For the global community, the Nigerian crisis poses an uncomfortable question. What responsibility do powerful nations have when a democratic partner begins to fail its people? The answer remains uncertain. But what is clear both to American officials and to citizens watching from afar is that Nigeria's crisis will not remain confined within its borders. If left unaddressed, it will shape migration, security partnerships, regional alliances, and the global fight against extremism for years to come. And for a world still recovering from decades of conflict, the thought of another flashpoint rising in West Africa is not just troubling, it is a reminder of how fragile peace can be when the world chooses to look away. When you step back from the individual stories, the terrified children, the grieving parents, the shattered churches, you begin to see a larger and far more troubling picture. Nigeria's crisis is no longer just a series of tragic incidents. It is a slow, relentless unraveling of a nation's sense of safety, identity, and dignity. And if the world does not treat this moment with the seriousness it demands, the consequences will not stop at Nigeria's borders. They will ripple outward, affecting West Africa global security partnerships and the fragile balance between peace and extremism that so many countries are still trying to rebuild. The warning signs are everywhere. Extremist groups are gaining ground faster than the state can reclaim it. Families are losing faith in their government. Schools and churches, places that should embody hope, are becoming targets. And the trauma being inflicted on an entire generation of children will shape Nigeria's future long after the headlines fade. It is here in these small, painful details that the true cost of inaction reveals itself. A nation can rebuild infrastructure, but it cannot easily rebuild the mind of a child who has lived through terror. This is why the international community must pay attention, not with distant sympathy, but with genuine commitment. Because we have already seen what happens when crises like this are ignored. We have seen regions collapse into ungoverned spaces, creating vacuums filled by extremist networks. We have seen communities pushed to the breaking point, and we have seen how threats that begin in one corner of the world eventually reach global shores. At a time when some African nations like Burkina Faso, under President Ibrahim Traore, are redefining security through local strength and self-reliance, Nigeria stands at a crossroads. Will it confront the forces tearing its society apart, or allow them to carve out permanent territories within its borders? That question does not belong only to policymakers. It belongs to citizens, to religious leaders, to mothers and fathers, and to the global audience watching these events unfold through Africa news coverage. And now I want to ask you, the person watching this, someone who has lived long enough to see the world change many times. Do you believe Nigeria can recover from this crisis with its current leadership? Or does the country need a new kind of courage, firm, principled, and unafraid to protect its people? Your voice matters more than you think. Conversations like this shape public awareness. Awareness shapes policy. And policy shapes lives. So if you believe children deserve protection, if you believe no community should face terror alone, please share this video. If you believe truth must matter more than headlines, subscribe and stay connected with us. Your engagement is not just support, it is a stand for human dignity.